That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, we're going to go through and dive into some of the rookie wide receiver comparisons. I know it's going to seem like I'm being dramatic. It's going to seem like I am trying to be the hype guy for these players, trying to get clicks, yada, yada, yada. In reality, we're just looking at a great wide receiver class. Y'all know I talked about the running back room and said, you know what? Yeah, Breece Hall, fantastic. Kenneth Walker, a more than capable first and second down running back. Beyond that, it's disgusting. Well, here at receiver, you have stud after stud after stud. Gonna be excited to look at these guys. But before we get into it, go down there, drop that like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you have not done so already, get our Dynasty research book. You can find so much valuable information there, and it is super easy to get. All you have to do is go down there to the description of the video, use promo code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy. I'm sure y'all have seen me drafting a ton of teams on Underdog, my favorite place to draft. And if you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy, make a $10 deposit, you will get our Dynasty research book. You will get access to our locals premium content, including extra live streams, including our rookie rankings, including our Dynasty rankings for free. Just make sure you go down there, make that $10 deposit with Underdog Fantasy, and they'll match your deposit dollar for dollar up to $100 with promo code FLOCK. And if you've already done so, you can actually just buy our Dynasty research book outright on flockfantasy.com. You can also find that link down there in the description. But that should be it. Let's go through. Let's dive into this. And I will be the first person to admit, I just had the realization that our rookie wide receiver rankings were wrong. Every single day this offseason, we had Treylon Burks as the wide receiver one. Well, I've been fine-tuning our process, changing how we are weighting these metrics to best fit the historical hit rate from rookies dating back to 2011. So over the past 10 years, we're looking at well over 100 wide receivers here. We're mapping them out based on different categories. The categories that we are going to be looking at: draft capital. Now, I will say our weighting in our algorithm here with draft capital is going to be significantly less at the receiver position than it was at running back. Running back, you have to really consider draft capital because that equals opportunity, that equals snaps, and snaps touches the running back position. They're everything. Wide receiver, you need the snaps and touches, but you also need the talent to be able to get open and get the ball. And we also weighted equally, to be completely honest, the players' dominance in college. And how we did this is not by receiving yards, not by receiving touchdowns. We looked at receiving yards, converted that to a per game basis, that player's best season in college, and then we divided their team's college passing yards on a per game basis that same season to figure out the percentage of the passing offense that receiver was accounting for. And we created that little number that you can clearly see with our data is extremely predictive going forward. And then our next category is actually going to be the breakout age of the player. And instead of focusing in on, oh, this player broke out at 20, this player broke out at 21, we are just going to be doing this season in college that they broke out. Now, if you were a redshirt and then you broke out your redshirt freshman season, that's going to count as your second season. However, if you're someone like Calvin Ridley that didn't get to college until you're like 20 years old, but you break out right away, then all of a sudden we're going to count you as a year one breakout. And then we also accounted for the 40-yard dash time. Now, y'all know at the running back position, we have talked about how important that is and how predictive that is of a statistic to find running backs with success. Well, it's not necessarily the same here if we were going to be looking at these wide receivers. And what's funny is, if you're too fast, it's a bad thing. If you're too fast, 9 times out of 10, that means you were pushed up draft boards and your draft capital is going to be overweighted because NFL teams can use you as that vertical element to stretch the defense, to create targets underneath for other players. And you're going to be a lot more valuable for an NFL team than you're going to be for fantasy. So it's kind of funny that if you passed a certain threshold with your 40-yard dash time, you were negatively impacted at the receiver position in our algorithm to make this as accurate as possible so we can really have a nice balance between the weighting of draft capital and 40-yard dash time, which is something we have to worry about at the receiver position because with receivers, there are a lot of different positions at the receiver spot. You got the Z wide receiver, you got the Alpha X wide receiver, you have the slot wide receiver, you have the field stretching option. There are so many different kinds. So we had to actually negatively impact wide receivers when they were too fast and negatively impact wide receivers when they were too slow. Even though I know it seems like it doesn't make sense, I promise you the data is here. And our most important metric that most people aren't going to be looking at. Now, I don't want to say it's most important compared to something that we are talking about with their actual production, but something that a lot of people are going to overlook is if that player declared early. This dramatically increased the accuracy of our historical analysis in determining if that player came out after their redshirt sophomore or true junior season. Then we also had a small weighting on the size of the receiver, particularly the weight of the wide receiver. And if they did not hit a certain threshold, we ding them negatively for that. And now, this is what makes, I think, our analysis significantly better than what you're going to find elsewhere. We went through and I mapped out by hand going to the best season that a wide receiver had where we generated their production metric. Now, of course, what do we always talk about? Production with context. So how do we put context into that? Of course, we can go player by player. We can talk about Drake London playing alongside Michael Pittman, Amara St. Brown, draft class to draft class. But if we're looking historically, how am I supposed to remember exactly who Josh Reynolds was playing with back in that 2015, 2016 season? I can't remember that. So what I have done is I've gone through and tracked every single one of these receivers, and we created a weighted metric based on how many other receiving options, including wide receivers and tight ends in their respective offense, were also drafted. This is what led to players at the very top of our metrics. I mean, I'll give you the top 5 players that we have graded out over the past, I want to say, 10 years now? Amari Cooper, 1. Sammy Watkins, Calvin Ridley, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. Those are the top 5 wide receivers. If you didn't have that NFL teammate grade, Amari Cooper, Sammy Watkins, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Calvin, these guys are all going to be a lot lower. And instead, you're getting up wide receivers that went to smaller schools that were able to dominate because there was nobody else there. This dramatically increased our accuracy. So I was excited to plug all these rookie wide receivers through this little algorithm and see that our number 1 guy, Drake London. Now, y'all know I love Drake London. We made a video about him at the beginning of the offseason. I said I wanted to put him at 1, but it was very hard to do so when he was projected to be like the 3rd or 4th wide receiver off the board in the NFL draft. We had the question marks around the injury, yada, yada, yada. Well, now it looks like Drake London has to be number 1. You go through, you look at these marks. I mean, Drake London was absolutely dominant at USC. He accounted for 45% of the passing yards on a per game basis his final season there. He was able to break out as a true freshman. He broke out as a true freshman there with Amara St. Brown and Michael Pittman on the roster. That didn't even get accounted for in this algorithm that he was that impressive. Now, going over to some other boxes, obviously he weighs enough. The 40-yard dash time, we're going to assume that he's not too slow. I know he didn't run at the NFL Combine, but it is what it is. And at the same time, one other assumption we're going to have to make, and this is going to be very difficult, and this is going to be something I have to do some more research on and definitely spend probably a couple weeks looking at. But we have to try to find out an accurate mark of how many of these players at USC are going to get drafted in the NFL from that 2021 season. Now, I am going to assume that USC at least has 1 player drafted, and I think it's going to be Gary Bryant. Now, keep in mind, I don't know anything about Gary Bryant outside of him being a 4-star prospect, goes to USC, breaks out in year 2, and looks great while doing so. So we're just going to be conservative, yet at the same time, give Drake London a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because he went to a premier program, and say he's going to have 1 college teammate drafted to the NFL. So if we go through and look at these marks, Drake London scores here only behind those 5 wide receivers that we mentioned previously: Amari Cooper, Sammy Watkins, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Calvin Ridley. That is where he stacks up historically since that 12 NFL draft class. Now, of course, we still have to see the NFL draft capital. I personally projected Drake London to go around pick 15 to 16. And I think that's probably where he's going to go. If he goes higher, it's not really going to impact this. It would at the running back position, wide receiver. That draft capital is not nearly as important as these production metrics. So since then, I've had to go through and move Drake London up our rankings. We pushed him ahead of Treylon Burks. Treylon Burks isn't even our wide receiver 2 anymore after this research. And in our overall dynasty rankings, I would want to wait until we see a landing spot, but I have also moved Drake London above a tier. So now he is our wide receiver 16. I have him in the same tier as DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, and Deontay Johnson. But Drake London's looking like an absolute stud. Let's go over to our next guy. Our next guy is going to be Garrett Wilson. Now, Garrett Wilson, the reason that he is popping off here is going to be, I guess a couple. A, if you're looking at his breakout, he broke out year 2. That's completely fine to see. B, he is going to be a mid-first round NFL draft pick, possibly going to be the first wide receiver off the board in the NFL draft. More importantly, he declares early at the same time. He goes out there as a completely fine 40-yard dash time, nothing to raise any alarms. Now, the final metric that's really helping him out here is if you look at Garrett Wilson and you look at his best year at Ohio State in terms of his production metric, that was back in 2020. And in 2020, Garrett Wilson accounted for 34.49% of his overall college's offense. And of course, that's not, groundbreaking by any means. You have Christian Watson at 44%, Sky Moore at 42%, Drake London at 45%, Treylon Burks at 46%. So how are we having Garrett Wilson ranked all the way up here? The reason is, on that same roster, you had 3 receivers that are going to go round 1 in the NFL draft. And he was able to hit those marks. He came out, he checks every single box that we are looking at. And he actually scores as a 39 right below Drake London. Garrett Wilson has a fantastic score. I don't want to say worried about his weight. If he weighed in a little bit less, he would have been dinged. So maybe that's something we need to at least bring up. Now, this is not to say that Garrett Wilson is an automatic hit at the next level. There's a wide range of outcomes that you've seen. Other wide receivers that have graded out similarly. You have Odell Beckham Jr. You have CeeDee Lamb as the, I don't want to say best case scenarios. Yeah, best case scenarios. And then worst case scenarios. These guys graded a little worse than Garrett Wilson, but I wanted to include them because I didn't want it to just seem like I was being very hot takey. And I could see him going down this path. It's definitely in the range of outcomes. Some wide receivers that look similar, that graded out just slightly worse, would be guys like Corey Coleman and Jalen Reagor. So there is a much wider range of outcomes once you get to this tier of these wide receivers, and that's going to be different than the running back position. Remember, if you purchased our Dynasty research book and you've read that and you've seen those historical hit rates of the top end running back prospects versus the top end wide receiver prospects coming into the NFL, you have a great understanding already that those players at the running back position are so easy to predict. We know with 90% certainty that Breece Hall is going to be fantastic. While we can sit here and say, yeah, these rookie wide receiver prospects are elite, still, it's in the range of outcomes for them to turn into Corey Coleman, for them to turn into Jalen Reagor. And now our third wide receiver on this list is going to be someone that was formerly our wide receiver 1, but we had to move him down just because if you're looking at the offense he's playing in, no college teammates coming out of it. His draft capital is going to be a little bit worse than what you had with Garrett Wilson and Drake London as well. We have Treylon Burks here. Now, I want to put a massive asterisk, and this is something that I really don't know how we actually incorporate in our dynasty rankings as it stands, but what's going to be interesting is the fact that Treylon Burks right now projects to go in the best spot in the draft. Treylon Burks looks like he's going to be a late round 1 pick, very similar to someone like Chris Salave, very similar to someone like Jamison Williams, possibly George Pickens, Jahan Dotson. We know that the teams picking at the very top end of the round that need receiver, like a team like Washington, Garrett Wilson goes to Washington. It's very hard to get excited about that landing spot. Whereas the wide receivers that maybe aren't as good of prospects that can last until late round 1, they could end up going to Kansas City. They could end up going to the Green Bay Packers, who have 4 picks at the end of the first round combined. And clearly both teams are in the market for a receiver. So Treylon Burks could easily go back up to our wide receiver 1 spot if he goes to, say, the Green Bay Packers at pick 22. But if we are looking at this mark, he checks every single box. The only issue is if you're comparing him to Drake London, if you're comparing him to Garrett Wilson, he wasn't dominating the same level of competition with receivers on his own team. Now, if we are looking at Treylon Burks, the best dominator rating in the class, he has a year 2 breakout as well. So comparing him to other receivers historically, it's going to be also a difficult task. There were a couple top-end names. One player that popped off in our metrics and was a screaming dynasty value 2 years ago is actually T. Higgins. Now, T. Higgins isn't a great comparison because Higgins had the target competition with other college teammates. However, I mean, he didn't have the same production, but they graded out very similarly at the end of the day. Maybe I'm just pulling that name up because they have the same grade and at the same time, they're the same size. Someone that would actually make a lot more sense to compare to Treylon Burks, in my opinion, would be someone like Devante Parker. I think Devante Parker would almost be a perfect example of this player. A.J. Brown is another guy that pops off at the same grade. Now, with A.J. Brown, this is someone that had the target competition in college with Metcalf, with Elijah Moore, with Dawson Knox as well. So it's a little bit of a different scenario with the metrics going in the back end. So I would say your upside case here, T. Higgins, A.J. Brown, but there are some players on the opposite end of the spectrum that we still have to be worried about. I mean, someone like Devante Parker, N'Keal Harry also looks very, very similar to Treylon Burks. So like we said, it's a little bit of give and take with these receivers. They can still be elite prospects and have a very low floor. Now, going over to our next guy, someone that I honestly am very excited about at this point. Like, with the disrespect he continuously gets in the dynasty community, just sign me up for Chris Salave. I mean, Chris Salave grading out as a player that his best case scenario looks like Chris Godwin. Now, of course, it's a little bit different. Godwin at Penn State, had some target competition, but he was a lot more dominant, and he declared at an early age compared to Chris Olave staying all 4 years at Ohio State. But the thing helping out Chris Olave, very similar to Garrett Wilson. Chris Olave played on that Ohio State team that had three receivers outside of Chris Olave going in the first round of the NFL draft in 2020 were on that same roster. And in that season, Chris Olave accounted for almost 40% of the production on a per game basis with their receiving yards at Ohio State. So if you combine those two things, that is massive for Olave. Now, the red flag that you're going to be looking at is he does not declare early. Historically, that's going to be something that definitely we need to keep an eye on. And at the same time, he doesn't break out till year 2. So if Chris Olave declared early, if he declared after that 2020 season, I would tell you he would be popping off in this model, and he would be higher than someone like Treylon Burks, higher than someone like Garrett Wilson. Of course, he didn't. So we do have to ding it against him because there could be something that we're not looking at, and him not declaring is covering that up. But nonetheless, if we're comparing him to some of the other players, I mean, Chris Godwin, what I really like as a comparison actually is going to be Jerry Judy. Because if you're looking at Jerry Judy, you see a very similar pathway where, he doesn't necessarily go out there and just turn into that Treylon Burks player with the absolute dominance, but he is getting a massive bump up based on the competition for targets that he had in that offense. So I'm seeing a very similar comparison from Chris Olave to Jerry Judy. Chris Olave also looks similar to Christian Kirk with how this grades out, not necessarily how they played at Texas A&M versus Ohio State, but another interesting mark for Olave. And let's go to another receiver. Our wide receiver 5, going to be Jamison Williams. Now, Jamison Williams, I'm fine if you want to take him a wide receiver 5. Just for the love of God, don't take him over Chris Olave. And I would say that if we're looking at these grades, this grade's not taking into account the fact that Jamison Williams tore his ACL at the very end of the year. So we even have to lower him down a little bit further than this. But he grades out definitely worse than all these other guys because he doesn't break out till year 3. And when he does break out, I understand that, he was the best receiver on the best team in college football. But at the end of the day, he didn't dominate that offense like Devontae Smith did the year prior. He was competing for targets with John Mechie. And outside of that, really nobody at Alabama was at the very top end of the projection with NFL draft capital. Like, it's not a Jerry Judy type situation where he's having to play with Devonta Smith. He's having to play with Henry Ruggs. He's having to play with Jalen Waddle. No, those guys were gone out of Alabama. So Jamison Williams steps in. He accounts for a little over 30% of the receiving yards on a per game basis his final season there. He doesn't break out early. He should have the speed. What's nice is he declares early. He's going to get the NFL draft capital. He did play with at least one wide receiver going in the NFL with John Mechie. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say his final year at Alabama, there was at least one other wide receiver that's going to the NFL on that roster. So I bumped it up to 2. Of course, that's a projection. I definitely need to look a little bit more into that, but I'd imagine that Alabama knowing the team, knowing the recruits that they get, have multiple receivers from that roster going to the NFL. So we called it 2. And if we're looking at the players that he projects to be similar to. Now, I don't want to just rain on everybody's parade, but let me list off some of the names that have the same grade. Laviska Shenault, Nelson Aguilar, really like the Aguilar projection. Jordan Matthews, I know that sounds like a bad name because it didn't pan out in the NFL. That was due to injuries. Jordan Matthews would have been a massive hit in the NFL. Marquis Lee, DJ Chark, I actually really like that comparison. Allen Robinson and Deontay Johnson. Now, Deontay Johnson, they have 2 completely different playing styles. He's not Deontay Johnson at all. I think a much more realistic sense with Jamison Williams, very similar to DJ Chark. I think these are 2 players that, are field stretching options that are a little bit more slender, that are going to provide more value to their NFL team than they're going to provide in fantasy. So I'm kind of off Jamison Williams, especially because I know he's going to go high in the NFL draft based on that speed, and probably it's going to push him too high up Dynasty draft boards. Now, I will be excited to dive deeper into the wide receiver position. This video is already 20 minutes, so we're going to cut it here. But y'all know I was saying at running back, it was disgusting. Literally, those guys at the end, like Zamir White, I just have no interest. And to be completely honest, I have no idea why people are talking about the position being deep when it's not deep at all. Wide receiver, this is going to be somewhere I want to dive a little bit deeper in. I'm going to be spending the next month going into these players, probably one by one, to give a really good sense of someone like Wan'Dale Robinson and try to figure out exactly how he should be valued historically. And also, if you read our Dynasty research book, you probably know by now that later on in rookie drafts, we should be targeting wide receivers. But of course, thank you so much for being a part of the flock. Go down there, drop that like, leave a comment, let me know how stupid I am, subscribe to the channel, and I hope that you have a great day.